I always liked camping alone. It wasn't because I was trying to get away from people, not really. I just liked the quiet, the way the woods sounded when everything finally settled, how the wind moved through the trees, how a fire crackled after dark. Something about being alone in that kind of space made me feel more like myself. This trip was in early fall. The nights were already cold, and the days were just warm enough to be comfortable. I had found the spot on a topo map. No trails, no official campsites, just a clearing tucked away near a creek in a part of the forest that didn't get many visitors. I planned to stay 3 nights, take my time, fish a bit, read, and just be outside. I parked at the end of a forestry road, loaded up my pack, and hiked in about 5 miles. The clearing was better than I expected. Flat, soft ground, some natural windbreak from fallen trees, and close enough to the creek to hear the water without being right on top of it. I set up my tent under a stand of pine, got a fire going, and cooked some beans and rice over it. That first night was peaceful. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind and the faint rush of the creek and drifted off. The second day I fished. The creek was cold, shallow, and fast-moving, but I managed to catch 2 small trout by early afternoon. I cooked them up with some foil and seasoning I'd brought and sat by the fire, eating slowly, watching the flames. After sunset, it got cold fast. I added more wood to the fire and sat there until it burned low. Then I crawled into my bag again, feeling full and tired in a good way. I'm not sure what time it was when I first heard it. I'd been asleep, but something pulled me out of that deep sleep fast. Not like a dream, something outside. A crack or snap, not wind, not an animal stepping lightly. It sounded like something big had stepped on a dead branch. I lay still and listened. A few seconds passed. Then another crunch. Heavy, measured, something moving just outside my tent. I had bear spray and a small fixed blade knife, but that was it. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Another step. Closer. Then silence. I lay awake until morning. Whatever it was didn't mess with anything. My food bag was still hanging from a tree limb, untouched. No torn up ground. No paw prints that I could see. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a deer or elk. Maybe I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I'd heard it. I decided to stay one more night, but I packed up everything so it'd be quick to leave the next morning. That day was quiet. I hiked a short loop around the area, checking the lay of the land. Didn't see much. Some squirrels, a hawk overhead, a few fresh deer tracks in the mud near the creek. Nothing unusual. I tried to relax. I built up a big fire that night, cooked some oatmeal and dried fruit, and sat close to the flames. The third night, I couldn't fall asleep. I kept hearing the wind hit the trees, and every now and then a small crack or thump would snap me to attention. I kept my headlamp nearby and my bear spray even closer. I didn't know what I was expecting. Probably nothing. Still, I was alert, hyper-aware. Around 1 a.m., I saw something move just beyond the firelight. I had let the fire die down to embers, so the clearing was mostly dark except for the faint orange glow and the stars overhead. I sat up inside the tent, pulled the zipper back slowly, and looked out. For a second, I saw nothing. Then, near the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet out, something stood up. I thought it was a man at first, tall, thin, but the way it moved wasn't right. It stood on 2 legs, hunched slightly forward, with long arms that hung down. I couldn't make out details, but I could see that it wasn't wearing clothes. It looked bare, but not smooth, patchy. It had no clear face that I could see, just the suggestion of one. I didn't move. It shifted its weight, stepped slightly sideways, then stopped again. I couldn't hear anything but the blood rushing in my ears. It stood still for maybe a full minute. Then it dropped back down on all 4s and moved back into the dark trees. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I left at first light, breaking camp quickly and hiking hard the entire way back. I didn't stop for water or rest until I got to the car. Once inside, doors locked, I sat there, panting, not because I was out of breath, but because I finally felt safe enough to let myself react. Later, when I got home, I tried to look up what I had seen. I didn't want to believe I'd seen what I thought I did. I found stories, posts on forums, and sketchy websites. Most people called them skinwalkers or wendigos. I didn't believe in any of that. I wanted a real explanation, something that made sense. Eventually, I found a thread about bears with mange. One guy said that a black bear with severe mange, especially if it was underweight and sick, could look eerily human. If it stood upright, especially in the dark, it could appear almost like a tall, hairless figure. Someone had posted a picture of one taken by a trail cam. I stared at it for a long time. The thing in the picture looked sick and wrong. It was a bear, sure, but stripped of fur and mass. It looked like something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, its skin sagging and raw in places. If I had seen that in the dark, standing upright, I would have sworn it was something unexplainable. I still don't know if that's what I saw. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But I haven't camped alone since. It's not the idea of wildlife that scares me. I've dealt with animals in the woods before. What really gets under my skin is knowing how easily my mind could turn something explainable into something terrifying. Out there in the dark, your brain tries to fill in the blanks. It builds shapes where there aren't any, adds eyes where there's only shadow, gives meaning to movement that could be nothing more than a breeze or a dying tree limb shifting. What I saw was probably a sick bear. A bear with mange, underfed, confused, maybe looking for food. But when I remember it, when I really let myself think about that moment, what I feel isn't just fear. It's something deeper, something instinctive, like a warning, something that tells me I was never supposed to see it that way. That kind of thing sticks with you. It's been over a year now. I still go hiking, still spend time in the woods, but I don't camp alone anymore. I don't sleep without a solid barrier between me and the dark. And whenever I see reports online about strange human-like shapes in the trees or eerie figures near campsites, I wonder how many of them saw what I did. How many of them saw a dying bear and thought they were looking at something else? How many of them never came back to tell the story? I was about 17 when I did the 3-feather challenge. It was something we all knew about from the time we joined Scouts. It wasn't mandatory for everyone, but if you wanted to wear the full colors and be considered part of the old school, the real core, you had to go through it. 1 day without food, 1 day without speaking, and 1 full day and night alone in the forest with only a tarp and a knife, unseen by any other human. And then you had to sneak past the patrols back into camp before morning roll call. That last part was almost more about stealth and nerve than anything else. Everyone talked big about it, but when your time came, it hit you different. By the time it was my turn, I thought I was ready. I'd watched a dozen others go through it, had heard all the little tips, and practiced sleeping without a sleeping bag, walking quietly, staying low. My bag was already packed for the return hike, and I'd even tied a spare pair of socks in a plastic bag around my waist under my shirt. I took it seriously, not just because I wanted to pass, but because I really wanted to prove I could handle it on my own. I picked a direction opposite from the popular trails and headed deep into the forest, away from where most people would wander. We were at a remote part of the parklands, and once you got about 2 or 3 miles out, the woods turned thick with undergrowth and uneven ground. There were thorns in places, wet leaves layered thick, and the kind of ferns that went up past your knees. I kept going until I was tired, then picked a spot tucked between 2 dense clusters of trees, where the canopy overhead was almost total and the light barely touched the forest floor. I set up a lean-to with the tarp and tied it between 2 trees at an angle so I'd stay dry in case it rained, then piled up pine needles and leaves under it to insulate the ground. The knife stayed at my side the whole time. The rest of the day, I mostly just lay there or walked a few hundred feet in either direction, trying to make sure I remembered the way back. I didn't eat. I didn't talk. I didn't see another soul. At night, I barely slept. Not from fear, but from how aware I was of everything. You hear more than you think out there. Every rustle, every creak, every distant snap of a twig. Even the wind moving through the upper branches sounds different when you're alone. But nothing came close to me. A few squirrels, maybe a raccoon in the brush. Otherwise, it was just me, the bugs, and the woods. I waited until just before first light to move. The plan was to wash my face, maybe dip in the lake quick before hiking back. There was a lake a half mile or so west of where I'd camped. I'd seen it on the map during planning. Not huge, more like a large pond, but clear enough and usually quiet. I got up stiff, brushed myself off, folded the tarp as best I could, and started making my way toward the lake. The woods weren't fully lit yet, and the air had that cold morning dampness. You could smell the dew forming on everything. I moved quietly, even though I didn't need to now. Habit from the night before, I guess. My legs were sore from sleeping on the uneven forest floor, and my stomach had that hollow, weak feeling after a day of fasting. I figured a quick dip in the water would wake me up and wash off the sweat and grime before heading back. As I got closer to the lake, I started hearing voices. Not loud, just soft tones and the clink of gear. I froze, looked through the trees and saw some movement near the shore. A group of maybe 4 or 5 men were standing along the bank with rods and tackle boxes. Anglers. I hadn't expected anyone to be out here this early or this far out, but I didn't panic. I crouched low, tried to back up slowly. I didn't want to blow the challenge by being seen. My plan was just to go somewhere else, maybe splash some water from a stream or just head back dirty. I'd made it this far. I wasn't about to screw up now. But I took one step too far off the worn path and the ground gave out from underneath me. No warning, no crack or crunch, just a soft sink and then a sudden drop. It wasn't like falling off a ledge. It was more like stepping through crust into something hollow. My right leg went in first, then my left as I tried to stop myself. My arms shot forward and I ended up chest deep in some kind of pit. My skin started to burn almost immediately. Not from fire, but from the smell. It wasn't just bad, it was absolutely vile. The best way I can describe it is like a mix of blood, rotted meat, urine, and wet dirt. But worse, I looked down and saw that I wasn't in mud. It was a thick, sticky mess of decaying organic matter. Bones, chunks of flesh, fur. I saw the back half of a deer floating to my left, its skin sloughing off. Guts, dozens of them. Everything was red and brown and black, all fused into one sludge-like mass. It hit me then this was a poacher's dump pit. Some illegal hunters must have been using this spot to dump the leftovers from their kills. The remains had probably been fermenting for weeks, maybe longer. With no scavengers and no airflow, it had turned into a pit of horror. I started screaming. I don't even know what I screamed. I just know it came out raw, unfiltered. Panicked. My arms thrashed as I tried to pull myself out, but the walls of the pit were soft and slick. I could feel bones shift under my knees as I tried to get leverage. I gagged hard, threw up once, maybe twice. It was hard to breathe. The smell was that bad. My nose and eyes were burning. Somehow I got enough grip to climb out, slipping and dragging myself up the side. I don't remember how long it took. It felt like forever. My clothes were soaked. My skin was covered in gore. I looked down and couldn't tell where my own body ended and the rot began. I couldn't even feel cold anymore. Just the rush of panic and the overwhelming drive to get clean. I bolted. I didn't care about the guys by the lake. I didn't care if I was seen. I ran straight for the water, crashing through the last bit of trees and sprinting down the hill toward the lake. I must have looked like something out of a nightmare. Soaked in blood and black sludge, barefoot, wild-eyed, still screaming or maybe sobbing, I don't know. The men fishing turned toward the noise. I saw their heads snap my direction. A few stepped back. One dropped his rod. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept moving until I hit the water, dove in, and started scrubbing myself furiously. The cold hit me then. Not just the water, but the shock of it all. I started shaking. I scrubbed until my skin felt raw, even underwater. I peeled off my shirt and flung it onto the rocks. It was useless. I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, dunking again and again, trying not to gag every time the smell on my hands reached my face. It was still there, clinging to my hair, my skin, even after I washed. The men stood a ways back. I didn't look at them long, just enough to see that they weren't coming closer. They must have thought I was insane or dangerous. I don't blame them. I probably looked like a lunatic crawling out of a gore pit. I didn't talk. I just got out, walked up the bank, grabbed a stick to scrape my shoes clean, then hiked back into the trees. I picked a roundabout way to circle back to camp, avoiding everyone. I had to stop at a stream to scrub again. I still felt like I stank. My skin itched like the rot had sunk into my pores. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was up. I stayed low, waited for the patrols to move, then crept past the edge and got into the mess tent. I sat behind the storage crates for a good hour before someone came by and noticed me. I nodded, gave the report, and the challenge was marked complete. But I didn't talk for the rest of the day. Couldn't. The smell was still in my nose. I spent another half hour scrubbing with soap at the camp showers. It didn't help much. Even when I got home days later, it was like the memory of the smell was still there. My clothes went straight into the trash. I shaved my head a few days later just to feel clean again. Now I know why you don't wander too far off the trail, and why I'll never look at a lake or a quiet forest quite the same way again. We'd planned the trip months in advance. It was supposed to be one of those once-in-a-lifetime getaways where you disconnect from everything, take only what you need, and disappear into the woods for a week. It was late September, just cool enough that the bugs had mostly died off, and the colors of the trees were deep and orange and golden. I remember the way the air smelled when we first stepped out of the car. Wet leaves, pine, the faint trace of wood smoke drifting from someone else's distant fire. It was the kind of smell that felt like home. We hiked out for a long time, past the last trail marker, deep into the forest where the trees thickened and the underbrush swallowed the path behind us. It wasn't a huge forest by any stretch, but it was isolated, the kind of place where you could walk in circles for days if you didn't know your bearings. We brought topo maps and a compass, a sat phone just in case, but we'd promised to leave the technology off unless there was an emergency. We wanted to be off-grid. I remember the first night being perfect. We set up the tent on a soft patch of moss beside a narrow creek, far from the trail and surrounded by huge trees that swayed slightly even in the still air. We cooked beans and sausage over a tiny fire, wrapped in sleeping bags and talking about everything and nothing. We didn't talk much after that first night, at least not about anything important. The cold started to seep in. The food supply felt thinner than we thought it would. But worse, something shifted between us out there. Something invisible at first, but it grew. By the third night, I knew the silence between us wasn't just from fatigue or the weight of the wilderness. It was heavier. There was a look in his eyes, blank, almost calculating. I catch him staring when he thought I wasn't looking. Not in the loving way he used to. This was different. I can't explain it fully. Just a look that made my stomach twist. I brushed it off at first. Cold can mess with your head. Hunger too. But that feeling didn't go away. It deepened. I woke up once in the middle of the night. My fingers were numb from cold, and the air in the tent felt damp. I rolled over and saw him lying wide awake, his eyes open, just staring up at the ceiling of the tent. He didn't flinch when I moved, didn't blink. He just laid there, breathing shallowly like he wasn't really asleep but not really awake either. I should have said something. I should have asked, but I didn't. The next morning, we barely said a word to each other. We each ate a dry protein bar and sipped cold water. I tried to start a conversation. He just nodded. The silence became unbearable. Something was clearly wrong, but neither of us said it aloud. I think we both knew. On the fifth day, he found the patch of mushrooms. At first, we were excited. It felt like a blessing from the forest, a rare stroke of luck. But I was cautious. I didn't recognize the type. They weren't morels or chanterelles or anything I was familiar with. He insisted they were fine, said he'd read about them before, picked them as a kid. I didn't argue, but I didn't eat any either. He cooked some up in a pan with the last of our butter. The smell made my stomach turn. That night he was shaking, not from cold, something deeper, a tremble in his core. He said it was just exhaustion, that he needed to sleep it off. I offered to pack up in the morning and head back. He just smiled, faintly, and told me we'd be fine. He was dead by dawn. I woke to the smell of something awful, something thick and sour in the tent. His skin was pale. His lips were blue. There was foam dried at the corner of his mouth. His eyes were partly open, but not in any way that meant life. I just laid there for a while, staring at him. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. I knew he was dead, but my brain refused to accept it. The cold air in the tent seemed to collapse in around me. I reached out and touched his hand. Stiff, cold. His skin didn't give. There was no softness to it anymore. That's when I remembered the second pan of mushrooms. He'd cooked 2 batches. Said he wanted to make sure we had enough for the next day. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now, with him dead, I stared at the remaining food like it was radioactive. I sat up, breathing hard, my stomach churning. I checked the sat phone. Dead. I must have left it on. Maybe it turned on by accident. Maybe it glitched. Either way, there was no help coming. No GPS. No signal. I was alone in a stretch of woods I no longer trusted, beside the stiff body of the man I came out here to escape the world with. I didn't know what to do. I sat outside the tent, arms wrapped around my knees, for hours. I thought about packing up and walking out, but my legs felt like sand. Every time I stood, I got dizzy. I hadn't eaten since the day before, and all we had left were those mushrooms. Everything else was gone. My body knew it too. My stomach cramped hard, and my head ached in pulses behind my eyes. At some point, I crawled back into the tent, half out of instinct, half out of cold. The sun was going down, and the forest had that strange quiet it gets just before nightfall, like everything was holding its breath. I laid down beside him. I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed not to, but the cold was too much. The sleeping bag barely helped. He still had some warmth left in his side of the tent, just enough to make it bearable. I thought I could tough it out, wait for morning, try to find a road or the old ranger cabin we passed on the hike in. But my body wouldn't listen. It was starving. My muscles trembled. My vision swam. The only food left was that damn second batch of mushrooms. I waited as long as I could, until full dark, until the cold made my fingertips tingle with that pre-frostbite numbness. Then yatethem. I told myself I didn't have to finish them, just a few bites, just enough to get some strength back. I laid back down beside him, wrapped in the sleeping bag we'd shared, his arms still partly draped over mine from earlier. I didn't have the strength to move it, and I told myself I didn't care, that it was just the cold making it feel worse than it was. Then the mushrooms kicked in. It wasn't dramatic. No colors or lights or hallucinations. Just a deep, nauseating burn in my gut that spread outward. My chest tightened. My mouth filled with spit. I turned to puke, but nothing came out. My body just locked up. My muscles cramped. I shook, and all the while, I could feel his dead arm, stiff and heavy, draped over me. His body didn't move. It didn't warm. It was still and lifeless, but it was there. I laid like that for hours. Every second stretched into a lifetime. My body twisted in waves of sickness. Every inch of me soaked in cold sweat and terror. I wanted to scream, but didn't have the strength. I couldn't even roll away from him. His weight kept me anchored. My mind began to float, drifting in and out of something close to unconsciousness, but never all the way. Every time I opened my eyes, the dark ceiling of the tent stared back, pressing down on me like a lid. I thought I was going to die. I thought I'd die right there, tangled in the arms of a dead man, both of us rotting slowly into the moss. But I didn't. At some point, maybe hours later, maybe more, I woke up to the faintest light coming through the tent fabric. Morning. I was still alive. My gut still hurt. My mouth was dry as ash. My muscles ached like I'd been beaten. But I was alive. He was still dead. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just rolled away from him, crawled out of the tent, and threw up bile into the leaves. My body heaved until there was nothing left. Then I laid face down in the dirt and let the cold sink in. I packed slowly. I didn't bother trying to carry him. Couldn't. And I didn't want to. I buried what I could, piled stones over the rest. It wasn't proper, but it was all I had. Then I walked. I don't remember most of the hike out. I know I followed the creek for a while, eventually hit an old dirt path, walked until I hit a paved road, collapsed in front of a ranger truck passing by. They took me to a hospital, ran tests, said I was lucky, said I should have died, but I didn't. I've never gone back to that forest. I never will. His family buried what they recovered. They don't talk to me. I don't blame them. I don't talk much either these days. But some nights, when I can't sleep, I still feel the weight of that arm over my chest. Cold, heavy, lifeless, and I remember what it felt like to wait for death, wrapped in someone who had already arrived. I think about that week almost every day, even though I try not to. It's the kind of memory that sinks into your chest and just sits there like a stone. Heavy, cold, unmovable. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a weekend getaway, maybe 3 days if the weather held out. But it became something else entirely, something final. I still have trouble putting it all into words, but sometimes writing it down helps, so I'm gonna try. It started when I met Chris. We'd both been through our share of rough years. I had a bad breakup a year earlier that left me feeling hollow, like I'd wasted time I couldn't get back. Chris had been caring for his father, who passed after a long, slow illness. We met through mutual friends on a hiking day trip. Nothing fancy, just a couple of hours along a trail not far from town. He was quiet, steady, thoughtful, the kind of person who doesn't talk much but listens like it means something. I guess I needed that more than I realized. We didn't fall into each other fast. It was slow, steady, like layering warm blankets on a cold night. We hiked, camped, stayed up late just listening to wind in the trees. No drama, no fights, just peace, which was rare in my life. Chris had a little scar on his left hand, and I'd always trace it with my finger while we lay on the sleeping bags. He said he got it splitting wood when he was a teenager. I think about that now more than I should. By the time fall rolled around, we both knew we were in it for real. The kind of love that doesn't explode but grows deep roots. One evening in late September, we sat by the fire pit behind his house, wrapped in a blanket, watching the smoke drift upward into a navy sky. He said he wanted one last trip before winter, somewhere quiet and far out. Somewhere with no cell signal, no noise, no people. Just us. I said yes without even asking where. We packed light but well. 2 backpacks, sleeping bags, a small 2-person tent, a jet boil, a bare canister. Chris handled navigation. He always had a better sense for maps than I did. We chose a trail system out in a state forest a few hours north, one that looped around a lake and into a backcountry zone not often used once the weather started turning. The ranger we checked in with said we'd probably be the last ones out that season. I remember thinking how peaceful that sounded. The first day was perfect. Crisp air, leaves starting to turn. You could smell the pine and moss, that rich forest scent that clings to everything. We hiked 12 miles that day, following a trail along a ridge before dropping into a valley thick with birch and maple. We set up near a small creek, pitched the tent on a bed of soft needles. Chris made pasta and we ate by the fading light. That night, we curled up together in the cold, the kind that makes you grateful for another body beside you. I remember feeling safe. That's what I keep coming back to. I felt safe. The next morning, the weather had shifted. Thin clouds covered the sky, and the wind came through colder, sharper. We decided to press on to the lake, about 8 more miles. The trail narrowed, with switchbacks cutting across steep hillsides. We moved slowly but steadily. By early afternoon, we reached a clearing above the lake, maybe 200 feet up. The view was unreal, just this vast sweep of water reflecting gray clouds, and trees stretching forever in every direction. We were so far out that the quiet made your ears ring. That was our second camp. We stayed 2 nights there. On the second day, we didn't hike. We just rested, made coffee, watched the water. We talked about moving in together when we got back. Chris said he was thinking of selling his dad's house and getting something smaller for the 2 of us. Maybe a cabin. I remember smiling at that. He always made things sound so doable, even the big things. That night, the wind picked up hard. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of branches whipping and the tent walls trembling. Rain started just before dawn, slow at first, then steady. We waited it out until mid-morning and decided to start back, even if it meant hiking through wet trails. The weather had changed fast. The temp had dropped 10 degrees overnight, and the air had that dense, sharp bite that comes before a real cold front. As we started the return loop, I remember checking the map and noticing something off. The streams weren't where they should have been. Landmarks looked different. We kept following blazes, but some were faded or missing altogether. I chalked it up to weather or maybe just being tired, but by afternoon it was clear we'd taken a wrong turn. Chris didn't panic. He said we'd probably just looped too wide and could cut back the next morning. We set up camp again near a marshy area and boiled water for soup. But I could tell he was worried. He didn't say it, but I could see it in his face. That night was brutal. The cold came hard, deep into the bones. The wind kept up, and the rain returned. Sleet mixed in. Our gear held, mostly, but everything felt damp. Couldn't sleep. Chris kept adjusting his position like he was trying to stay warm, but couldn't. I curled into him, wrapped my arms around his chest, tried to pass some of my own heat. He kissed the top of my head. That's the last thing I clearly remember before drifting off. By morning, it was bad. The rain had soaked through parts of the tent, and our socks and base layers were wet. Chris had a shallow cough. I felt lightheaded. We ate what we could and started moving, hoping we could reconnect to the main trail. But visibility had dropped. Fog rolled in thick and low. We couldn't see more than 50 feet ahead, and the terrain started to shift. We kept climbing when we should have been descending. The trees changed too, less pine, more deadfall and thick underbrush. Around midday, we hit a rockslide, nothing huge, but enough to slow us. Chris's foot slipped and he twisted his ankle. It wasn't broken, but it was bad. He winced with each step. I tried to help support his weight, but I'm smaller than him. It slowed us to a crawl. That night, we camped again, this time in a low grove with barely enough flat ground for the tent. We had almost no food left. One energy bar between us. I insisted he take it. He didn't argue. The next morning, the temperature dropped below freezing. Our water bottles had a layer of ice on them. Chris's ankle was swollen badly. He couldn't put weight on it. We both knew we were in real trouble then. No cell signal, no road noise, nothing. Just us and trees and cold and time running out. I spent the day trying to find the trail again. I walked out in different directions from camp, using a compass to keep track, but everything blurred together. Hills, trees, fog, no markers. When I got back to camp, Chris was curled in the sleeping bag, shivering. He tried to smile. That night, we didn't sleep. We just lay there, clinging to each other. Our bodies couldn't get warm anymore. My fingertips were numb. My thoughts started to slow. It was like sinking underwater. In the morning, Chris couldn't move. He was pale, lips cracked, breathing shallow. I knew what was happening. Hypothermia, dehydration. His body was shutting down. I boiled the last of our water and held the cup to his lips. He sipped, barely. He looked at me then. No panic, no anger, just a kind of peace, like he knew this was the end. I crawled in beside him and wrapped my arms around him again. Like that first night. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. That afternoon, the sun came out for a bit. I unzipped the tent to let light in. The warmth was faint but welcome. I laid there with him for hours, watching the light move across the fabric walls. Around dusk, I realized he wasn't breathing. His chest was still, his face soft. He was gone. I stayed there until dark, not really thinking, just numb. Then I zipped up the tent and lay back down. I thought about walking out, trying again, but I didn't. I didn't want to. It wasn't about giving up. It was about not leaving him. We had come out together. We had made that choice. All I could think was how much I loved him and how quiet the world had become. The next morning, I wrote a note in my journal with our names, dates, and what happened. I put it in a plastic bag and pinned it to the outside of the tent. Then I crawled back in and zipped it shut. I don't remember much after that. They found us 4 days later. A ranger patrol spotted the tent from a chopper doing a late-season flyover. I was alive barely. Severe frostbite, starvation. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. I lost 3 toes and half a finger. They told me if they'd been a day later, I wouldn't have made it. Chris was buried on a hillside near his father's place. I visit every fall when the leaves start to turn and the air gets cold again. I still have his jacket. I still trace the scar on the sleeve where the stitching is rough. I kept the journal too, with the note still inside. People always talk about love like it's some kind of fever, wild and messy. But real love, the kind we had, is quiet. It's steady. It's choosing each other every day, even when the days run out. We walked into that forest together because we wanted to be alone, to be with each other without the world pressing in. I'd always thought the stories people told about skinwalkers or strange, human-like creatures in the woods were just that, stories. I didn't believe in monsters. Never really had. But I did understand how the mind could play tricks on you, especially out there in the woods. When you're alone, tired, and it's dark, your brain fills in blanks with whatever it wants. That's what I thought. Anyway, it was early October when I went out to the mountains alone for a few days. I'd had a stretch of time off work and didn't feel like sitting around the house. I wanted to get away, sleep outside, and just disconnect for a bit. I'd camped by myself plenty of times before. I knew what I was doing. I wasn't looking for any kind of adventure, just quiet. I chose a spot deep in the national forest. No marked sites, no other people. The kind of place where you parked on the side of an old service road and hiked in until you couldn't hear the road anymore. I planned to stay 3 nights. I brought everything I needed: gear, food, layers for the cold nights. I kept it light but careful. I'd never had trouble in the woods before. The first day was uneventful. I parked, hoisted my pack, and followed an old trail I'd used once before, years earlier. It wasn't marked anymore, but I remembered enough of the route. I walked maybe 6 miles in. The air was crisp, the leaves mostly down already, and the forest was quiet. That dry, leaf crunch silence. Every step you took sounded loud. I picked a spot near a stream and cleared a place for my tent. I had a good view downhill toward the water, and the trees around me were mostly pine and bare maple. It was beautiful in that bleak, late fall kind of way. I set up camp, got a small fire going, boiled water for some freeze-dried food, and sat on a log to eat. As the sun dropped, the shadows got long fast. I added a little wood to the fire and watched it until the stars came out. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up tight, and fell asleep to the sound of wind through dry branches. The second day, I explored a little, followed the stream for a couple miles, saw a few deer tracks, but not much else. I didn't see or hear another person, not even a distant plane overhead. It was peaceful, if a little lonely. That night, I made a bigger fire, sat longer, and let the warmth push back the cold creeping into my legs and arms. I was comfortable, tired, but relaxed. That night, sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up without knowing why. It wasn't a sound that pulled me out of sleep, just that sudden, full-body alertness you sometimes get. I lay there, completely still, eyes open in the dark. The forest was quiet. I couldn't even hear the stream from inside the tent. I listened, waited, then I heard a crack. Came from somewhere behind the tent. Not far, maybe 30 feet. A solid branch breaking, like something heavy had stepped wrong. I tensed. Another sound, this time softer, like leaves shifting. Then nothing. I've heard bears before. I've even had them wander through camp. Usually they make more noise, sniffing, grunting, snorting. Whatever this was, it was quiet now. I lay still, barely breathing. I had my bear spray and a knife near my feet, but I didn't move. I just listened. I must have stayed that way for over an hour, heart thumping, eyes wide in the dark. Every small sound amplified in my ears. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning and sunlight was coming through the tent. I got up slowly, zipped the tent open, and stepped out. The air was cold. My breath came out in clouds. The ground was wet with dew. I walked a slow circle around my camp, looking for prints or scat or anything disturbed. I didn't see much. Just one place where the pine needles looked like they'd been pushed aside. Could have been an animal. Could have been nothing. I made breakfast and tried to shake it off. Maybe it had just been a deer, or a raccoon, or a bear that had passed through and moved on. Either way, it was gone now. I spent most of that third day walking a loop trail I'd found near the stream. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used by elk or moose. There were prints here and there, but no recent ones. The trail went up into a narrow ridge, and from the top, I could see out over the forest for miles. Rolling hills, patchy clearings, streams cutting through the valleys. It was beautiful in a hard, wild way. When I got back to camp, the sun was already low. I collected more firewood than usual, enough for hours, and got the fire going early. As it burned, I sat and watched the trees beyond the light. The quiet didn't feel as peaceful anymore. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I cooked dinner, ate slowly, and added wood to the fire. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening hard. Nothing moved. I stayed up until the fire was low, then climbed into the tent. I kept the bear spray right next to my head and slept in my clothes, boots and all. Sometime deep in the night, I heard it again. Crack, then silence. I didn't move. A second crack. Slower, closer, then what sounded like a low grunt, or maybe just a breath. I reached out and put my hand on the can of bear spray. My heart was pounding. Whatever was out there was walking on two legs. I could hear the rhythm of the steps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It didn't sound like a deer or a four-legged animal at all. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear something breathing, close, just outside the tent. The air inside the tent felt cold and tight. I didn't move. I didn't even blink, just listened. Then I heard a soft scraping sound, like claws or nails on the nylon fabric. Just one long scrape, then silence again. I lay there, frozen. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. No more sounds. I don't remember falling asleep. I must have, eventually. But when I woke up, it was still early, barely light out. And the first thing I did was unzip the tent and look. There were tracks in the dew-covered pine needles. Not boot prints, not paws either. They were spaced far apart, narrow at the heel, wider at the front. They looked almost human, but not quite. Longer, toes not right, like something with long, misshapen feet had walked in a circle around my tent. I didn't pack. I didn't eat. I just grabbed everything, stuffed it into my pack, broke camp in 10 minutes, and started hiking out. I didn't stop to rest once. I didn't drink water. I just kept walking. The feeling of something watching me never left. I didn't feel safe until I was inside the car, doors locked, looking back at the empty trees through the rearview mirror. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw or what I thought I saw. I didn't believe in monsters, still don't, but I wanted answers. So I started digging. Not on paranormal sites, not those creepy story pages. I looked into animal behavior tracking wildlife illness. That's when I found out about mange. Sarcoptic mange, specifically. A mite infection that causes animals, usually foxes, coyotes, and bears, to lose their fur, scratch themselves raw, develop thick, scaly skin, and act erratically. There were pictures, some from trail cameras, others from roadside sightings, and some of those pictures stopped me cold. Black bears with mange can look wrong. Standing up, covered in raw skin, ribs showing, fur only in patches, they look more human than animal. Their limbs look too long, their heads narrow, their posture off. In the dark, with no context, your brain tries to make sense of it, and sometimes it comes up with the worst answer possible. That had to be what I saw, what I heard, what scraped the side of my tent. A bear, sick, dying maybe, starving and drawn to the smell of food and warmth. It didn't want me, it didn't attack. It circled, curious or confused, and then it left. But in that moment, my mind didn't say bear. It said something else, something ancient and silent and watching. I can still picture it standing outside the tent, breathing, listening. I still hear that scrape sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. I haven't camped since. Not because I'm scared of bears, because I'm scared of how wrong my own brain was in the dark. I still believe in reality. I still believe in animals and logic and reason. But I also believe this, what we see, especially when we're alone and scared and half awake, isn't always the truth. And sometimes, the scariest thing in the woods isn't what's out there. It's what your mind turns it into. That trip taught me more than any news story or survival manual ever could. It reminded me that nature is wild, not just the animals, but our own minds, especially in the dark, especially when we're alone. And now I understand why so many of those stories sound the way they do. Not because they saw something unreal, but because, just like me, they saw something real, and their mind told them something else. And maybe that's the scariest part. It was my first real camping trip. 5 days and 4 nights in the backcountry, deep enough into the woods that I couldn't hear a single engine or see a cell signal. I went with a small group of experienced hikers and campers, but on that last night, they set up their tents a little farther off from mine. I didn't think much of it at the time. We'd all spread out a bit so we could enjoy the wide view. Our final campsite was up against the edge of an old wildfire burn scar, a wide open stretch where most of the trees were either reduced to blackened stumps or had fallen over completely. The forest here was thinner, easier to see through, but somehow that just made it feel even more exposed. I thought the open sky and bright moon would make for a peaceful final night. I'd been nervous about the trip in the days leading up to it, but everything had gone smoothly so far. I was proud of myself. I handled the long hikes. I kept up. I filtered my own water, helped pitch tents, started fires. I even hung my food like they showed me, high in a tree with a bear bag tied off properly and far from camp. No real problems until that last night. After dinner, we all sat around the fire for a bit, passing around trail mix and quietly talking while watching the last bit of sun drop below the ridge. I didn't say much. I was mostly just soaking it all in, proud of having made it to the end of the trip and excited to sleep in my own bed the next night. Eventually, we all drifted off to our tents, one by one. I zipped up my tent flap, pulled my sleeping bag up to my chest, and lay there looking at the top of the tent lit silver from the full moon. I fell asleep quickly. I was tired from the hike that day. The air was cool, just cold enough that I had to wrap myself up tight, but not freezing. Perfect for sleeping. I remember waking up to go pee sometime around midnight, fumbling my way out of the tent, walking a little ways off, and then crawling back into the bag half asleep. That's when I heard it. A sharp, repeated chirp. It cut through the silence so cleanly that I thought at first it had to be someone's gear beeping or a watch alarm. But it was a bird. The sound was piercing, clear, and came in groups of 3, spaced out every few minutes. At first I thought it was interesting, a bird call I didn't recognize. Then it kept going, again, and again, and again. At first I thought maybe it was just a territorial call or some kind of nocturnal pattern, but it felt deliberate, like an alert, not random. It had a rhythm to it, like it was trying to get something's attention. The noise was sharp and angry. If I had to describe it in one word, it would be warning. Then I heard something else. Movement in the brush. To my right, something large moving through the dry, brittle undergrowth. I could hear twigs snapping, the kind of cracks that only come from weight, real weight, pressing down on dead sticks. Then the sound of something brushing against branches. Slow, steady movement. The footsteps weren't hurried or clumsy. It didn't sound like a person, and it didn't sound small. It was too heavy. I sat up, every muscle in my body tensing. I didn't want to unzip the tent or shine a light. The moon outside was full, and I could see shadows shifting faintly on the tent walls, but I couldn't make out anything clearly. I stayed still, trying to keep my breathing quiet. My heart was pounding. I could feel it in my throat. Then the bird called out again. That same 3-note warning cry. Sharp, angry, almost panicked now. Then more movement, this time behind the tent. Still slow, still deliberate. Whatever it wasn't hurrying. It was just walking, but it was circling. I lay back down and pulled the bag up to my chin. I didn't know what to do. I had bear spray, but it was clipped to my backpack, which I'd left outside the tent's vestibule. My hiking boots were out there too. I had nothing in the tent except my sleeping bag, headlamp, and a water bottle. I listened hard, trying to hear if any of the others were moving in their tents nearby, but the woods were dead quiet except for the bird and the footsteps. Nobody else was awake. For the next hour, the pattern continued. The bird would call, then I'd hear movement, sticks cracking, something brushing through undergrowth. then silence, then another pass. It was always just far enough away that I couldn't see anything clearly, but close enough that I could hear it. The scariest part wasn't that it was out there. The scariest part was how long it stayed. Over and over, it circled my tent. The movement would fade, then come back from another side. Sometimes it would pause. Then I'd hear a heavy step again. Sometimes I could hear breathing, just a faint exhale, like the sound of something sniffing the air. At one point, I heard a longer pause. No steps, no movement. The bird stopped calling for a bit too. That was almost worse than the noise. The silence stretched on. Then I heard a stick snap, loud, like it broke under pressure, and I flinched so hard I accidentally kicked the side of the tent. The noise stopped. No more movement. No more bird. Just silence again. I didn't dare move after that. I just lay still, listening, waiting. The bird eventually started calling again, but fainter now, like it had moved farther off. The footsteps started again too, circling slower, almost dragging. There was no doubt in my mind now, whatever it was had been watching me, or maybe testing me. The pattern didn't feel random. Felt like it was waiting for something. The moon was bright enough that I could see through the mesh window at the top of my tent, and I could make out the shape of the burned trees against the sky. They stood like charred bones out there. The open area meant I could see a long way, and every time I thought I caught movement, I stared and waited, but nothing moved again. I never saw anything clearly. I didn't sleep at all that night, not a second. I stayed still until the sky started to lighten in the east. As the sun started to rise, the bird fell silent, and the movement stopped for good. No more cracking sticks, no more rustling in the brush, just morning wind through the trees. I waited a while before unzipping the tent. The air was cold and still. The ground was littered with twigs and dry pine needles. I stepped out slowly, heart still pounding, expecting to see prints or disturbed brush. But there was nothing. Not a thing looked different. I walked a slow circle around the tent, then a wider one. Nothing broken, nothing smashed. No big clear tracks, just the normal clutter of the forest floor. I walked farther toward the edge of the wildfire scar. The ground was more open out there, and I thought maybe I'd see something, maybe even just bare prints, but there was nothing clear. I kept looking anyway. I wanted a sign, something to make sense of what I'd heard all night. I found one spot where some of the underbrush had been parted, just slightly, like something big had brushed through, but it wasn't conclusive. I couldn't even be sure it hadn't been us earlier that day. When I got back to camp, the others were starting to stir. Nobody mentioned hearing anything. One of them said they'd slept great. I nodded and said nothing. I didn't want to sound dramatic or like I'd spooked myself, but inside, I was still rattled, shaking even. I packed up my gear fast, double-checked everything, and didn't let my eyes leave the treeline. As we hiked out that day, I kept thinking about the night before. The sounds, the way it circled me, the way the bird kept calling, the way the footsteps seemed to track with the call, as if the bird was following the thing, or maybe warning everything else about it. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving behind us, but there was nothing. When I got home, I looked up local birds. I found a few types that make loud, repeated warning calls at night, some species of owls, even certain jays. That part didn't surprise me, but the movement, the breathing, the circling, I thought about it for days. Could have been a bear, a black bear moving through the area, maybe curious about the tents, staying downwind and trying to decide if it was worth investigating. Bears with a lot of forest experience sometimes move slow and deliberate like that. Could have been that. That's the most logical thing. Still, there was something about how it didn't go for the food. It never touched the bear bag, never messed with the cookware. It just circled. I guess some people would say it could have been a cougar, but cougars don't make much noise, and they wouldn't keep circling for hours like that. Not without showing themselves, and not without going after something. So I tell myself it was a bear, just a black bear curious about the human sense. And I was safe inside my tent, even if I didn't feel like it. I didn't smell like food, and I didn't move or make noise, so maybe it just lost interest. That was over a year ago now. I've gone camping again since then, but I don't sleep the same out there anymore. Not since that night. I always set my tent closer to others now. I always sleep with my bear spray inside the tent, within reach. I don't leave anything outside. I double-check every tie-down and every bit of gear before bed. And I listen for birds. Not the morning kind, the ones that call out sharp warnings in the night. If I hear that again, I'm not waiting it out. That night taught me that sometimes the woods don't give you answers. Sometimes you just get fear and shadow. I've had a few close calls in the woods, but this one still stands out in my memory like a scar that hasn't faded. It wasn't bloody or dramatic. No one ran screaming. No one got hurt. But the kind of fear I felt in that moment stuck with me for a long time after I left those trees behind. And it all came down to a moment when something large and alive was just too close. So close I could feel it breathe. This happened at a state-run campground that I'd been to a few times before. Not deep wilderness, but still far enough off the road that the nights were silent and black, and far enough from the nearest town that the woods felt real. It was a basic setup, a mix of gravel and dirt campsites with picnic tables and metal fire rings, plus a shared bathroom about 100 yards from the site I had picked. No hookups or anything fancy, just space and trees. It wasn't remote enough to scare me when I booked the site, but by the end of the trip, I'd be thinking differently. I had gone with 2 friends, people I trusted and had hiked with before, and we'd planned for a long weekend, 3 nights, to unwind and reset a bit. We all had our own tents because we valued our space, but we shared gear and rotated meals. That night, the second night of the trip, we had finished up a really decent meal. Nothing crazy, just foil packets over the coals, some potatoes and sausage and onion. That kind of stuff always tastes better outside. We sat around the fire afterward, talking, just letting the quiet take over. It was just past dusk. You know that time of evening where everything gets still and the colors bleed out of the sky, but it's not quite pitch black yet? That was when it started. It happened fast. My friend on the far side of the fire jumped to her feet like something had bit her. She let out this kind of panicked yell, not words, just sound, and pointed toward the picnic table. We all scrambled for our flashlights, and within seconds we caught it in the beam. An adult black bear. Not small, not a cub, but a full-size bear standing right on top of our picnic table. The surface creaked under its weight. It wasn't even sniffing around at first. It just stood there, front paws forward, looking right at us like it wasn't afraid. That's what made my stomach drop. It wasn't charging. It wasn't snarling. But it wasn't afraid either. That made it worse. We started shouting, loud, clapping our hands, doing all the things they tell you to do in those pamphlets you get when you check in. The bear flinched a little, but it didn't bolt. It stepped off the table slowly, almost like it was annoyed, and ambled into the tree line. Didn't run, just walked away. We spent the next hour cleaning everything. Anything that smelled even remotely like food got sealed up. We poured water on the fire. We double-checked every zipper on our food storage bags and bear canisters. One of my friends had even brought a bear horn, the kind that lets off a blast like a freight train, and she tested it to make sure it was still working. We talked about maybe packing up and heading out, but it was late, and we were tired, and we figured the scare was over. It had probably come in because it smelled dinner, saw no easy meal, and left. But that wasn't the end of it. We all got in our tents a little on edge, but after a while, the quiet returned. I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like forever, staring up at the inside of the tent, watching the moonlight move across the nylon like a slow dance. The air was cool still. I could hear one of my friends tossing and turning in her tent, the occasional sniff or rustle from the other. But mostly it was just silence. Then, sometime after midnight, I woke up to movement. At first, I didn't even know what had stirred me. It was one of those half-asleep moments where something pulls you up out of a dream, but your mind doesn't catch up right away. I blinked a few times, listened. Nothing. Just the wind moving a little through the trees, soft and slow. But then it came again. A heavy step. Something big was moving through the leaves. Not fast, not frantic, just moving. One step, then a pause. Another step, another pause. I held my breath and listened. The sound was coming from the direction of the picnic table. It was back. I couldn't see much through the tent wall, just shadows. But the moon was full enough to make everything outside bright in that eerie, colorless way that moonlight does. The tent was lit enough for me to see the outlines of branches moving, and then something passed by that blocked out the light completely for a second. Something thick and heavy. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then I heard the sniffing. Slow, steady inhaling and exhaling like something testing the air. And then, and I'll never forget this for the rest of my life, I felt it above my head. I had laid down with my head toward the back of the tent, feet facing the fire pit. My face was only about a foot or two from the wall of the tent, and I felt this breath against the nylon, hot and damp, followed by a sniff so close it vibrated through the thin fabric. It was smelling my head. I was frozen, absolutely locked. I didn't move a muscle. I was sure if I even twitched, I'd feel claws or teeth or worse. It stayed like that for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, just standing there, breathing. I could hear it shift its weight, like it was standing on soft paws but still heavy. Something rubbed against the side of the tent. Not claws, just fur, maybe a shoulder. Then silence again. I waited, took another step, then another. I could track it by sound as it moved away from my tent, toward the other two. I wanted to call out to my friends, to make a sound, but I couldn't bring myself to break the silence. I didn't know if they were awake, if they even knew what was happening. I just lay there, stiff as a board, sweating in the cold, ears straining for every snap of a twig or rustle of a leaf. It circled the camp for hours. I didn't know it then, but I found the tracks the next morning, big, defined paw prints in the dirt. It never growled, never huffed. It just walked, sniffed, paused. Sometimes it would go quiet for 10, 15 minutes at a time, and I'd think it had gone, only to hear it again right outside. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, the forest started to shift. Birds started calling. Not a lot, just the early ones, robins maybe. But there was one bird that made this strange, loud, piercing call, almost like a warning. It echoed through the campsite every few minutes. I'd never heard anything like it. Sharp, urgent. Kept going until the sun started to break through the trees. That's when the movement stopped. I waited until it was fully light before I unzipped the tent. My hands were shaking. My shirt was soaked through from sweat. My legs barely worked. When I finally stood up, I looked around expecting to see damage, claw marks, trash, torn tents, but there was none. Just tracks, lots of them, around the fire pit, around each tent. Even a few on top of the picnic table again. My friends eventually emerged, pale and silent. One of them had slept through most of it, but the other had heard the steps, too. She said she'd been too scared to move. Said she heard it sniffing around her tent, too, but didn't realize how close it had come to mine. We packed up that morning without eating breakfast. I didn't even boil water. Just rolled up the sleeping bag with shaking hands and took everything down as fast as I could. We didn't really talk much on the way out. I think we were all still processing what had happened. I don't know for sure if it was the same bear from earlier. Could have been a different one. But the fact that it came back, that it wasn't scared off by noise or lights or shouting, that stuck with me. It felt like we'd been tolerated, not ignored. Like it had wandered in because it could, and didn't leave until it felt like it. Ever since then, I've taken food storage a lot more seriously. I use bare canisters, not just bags. I don't cook near where I sleep. I pay attention to where I set up camp. But even with all that, there's still that quiet fear that creeps in at night. That feeling of something just outside, breathing, sniffing, walking slow. I've camped a dozen times since then. I've done backcountry trips, solo hikes, even longer stays deep in national forests. But I've never forgotten that night. The heat of its breath, the sound of it moving in circles, the way the bird cried out over and over like it was trying to warn me. All of it's still clear, like it happened yesterday. I never saw it, never locked eyes with it, but that made it worse in a way. Not knowing what it wanted, not knowing what it might have done if I'd sneezed, or rolled over or sat up. It's easy to laugh about it now, to say, yeah, it was probably just a black bear. But when you're alone in a thin nylon tent and something that big is sniffing your head in the dark, there's no comfort in the word probably.